The first thing they noticed wasn't the silence. It was the smell. Sharp, burnt, unfamiliar, rising from a dented tin cup placed before them by the enemy. For days, the women had been living on water and fear, their hands trembling from exhaustion, their uniforms stiff with dried blood. Now the Americans offered them something dark and steaming, calling it coffee, black and hot. None of them moved. None of them spoke. In their world, black meant danger and hot was a warning. The Japanese nurses exchanged glances that carried both pride and terror. Was this a test, a trick? Medicine that would end them quietly? The youngest among them leaned closer, watching the strange liquid swirl like ink. It didn't look like mercy. It didn't smell like kindness. And yet this was how peace introduced itself, bitter, foreign, and misunderstood. They had stopped running hours ago, though none of them could remember when their feet had given up. The war had ended, or so the radio had said, words that felt impossible after years of thunder and flame. The small group of Japanese nurses now sat on a rocky slope, surrounded by the smell of rain and smoke. They had treated the wounded until the bandages ran out, until their own blood stained the ground they worked on. Now there were no more patients, only surrender. The forest around them was heavy with silence, broken only by the distant sound of boots. The Americans were coming. The women straightened their backs instinctively, clutching their small satchels filled with medical rags and broken scissors, the only tools left from their lost hospital. None of them spoke, but every heartbeat said the same thing. Be ready. They will hurt us. The first soldiers appeared through the trees, their helmets gleaming dully in the gray light. The women froze. They had been told stories whispered in bunkers and barracks of what Americans did to prisoners, especially women. Stories that made death sound merciful, so they braced themselves for shouting, for humiliation, for gunfire. But the men who approached looked tired. Their faces were streaked with mud, their uniforms torn, eyes shadowed with the same fatigue. They did not raise their weapons. Instead, one of them, tall, maybe 25, lifted a small metal cup and held it out. Steam rose from it, curling like smoke from the ashes of war. He said something they didn't understand at first, his voice calm and unthreatening. Then slower, "That's coffee, black and hot." The women stared at him as though he'd spoken another kind of weapon. One of them, the youngest, pressed her lips together and whispered in Japanese, "He's offering medicine." Another shook her head. "No, it's poison. They'll watch us drink it." Their leader, an older nurse named Ayako, said nothing. Her eyes, hollow but steady, stayed fixed on the soldier's hand. The man simply waited, holding out the cup as though it meant nothing at all. For a moment, time hung between them, two worlds separated by a language neither could translate. Then slowly, Ayako reached out. Her hands trembled so badly that the cup clinked against the metal rim of her canteen. She sniffed the contents cautiously. It smelled burnt, bitter, nothing like the tea of home. She hesitated, glanced up at the soldier, then back down at the dark liquid. Her reflection wavered on its surface like a ghost. She took a sip. The taste struck her like smoke and ash. She coughed, nearly spat it out. The soldier laughed softly, not cruelly, but with a strange gentleness that disarmed her more than any weapon could. He pointed to the cup again, repeating the word slowly. Coffee. Ayako swallowed, blinking away the sting in her throat. The other women looked at her, waiting for a sign. Death, pain, anything. But nothing happened. The cup was bitter, yes, but not deadly. One by one, the others inched closer. Curiosity overcame fear. A younger nurse named Michiko tried a small sip and grimaced. "It tastes like burnt rice water," she whispered. Yet there was warmth spreading through her hands, the first warmth they had felt in weeks. The soldiers said nothing more. They handed out more cups, a few blankets, and packets of something white, sugar. None of the women understood why their captors were being kind. It was as if the war had not ended with surrender, but with confusion. Hours later, they were escorted toward the American field camp. The rain began again, soft and relentless. As they walked, Michiko kept glancing at the mug she still carried. Its warmth was fading, but she couldn't bring herself to throw it away. It wasn't just a drink anymore, it was a question that had no answer. When night fell, the camp was quiet. Fires flickered in barrels, and the women huddled together under a tarp that smelled of oil and smoke. They didn't speak of home or defeat or shame. Only one word stayed in their minds: coffee. It was strange how something so small, so foreign, had changed the air around them. It had softened the edge of fear. It had reminded them in a way that words could not, that even in the ruins of war, warmth could still exist. Ayako sat awake long after the others had fallen asleep, watching the distant lights of the American tents. Somewhere a soldier laughed, a sound that should have angered her but didn't. She looked down at the empty mug beside her bedroll. The taste still lingered on her tongue, sharp and unfamiliar. She thought of how bitter it had been, how it had burned her throat. And yet, for the first time in years, she felt something she could not name. Perhaps peace didn't begin with surrender. Perhaps it began with a sip. The next morning came gray and wet. The camp smelled of damp earth, gun oil, and smoke. A thin mist lingered over the tents, and for a moment it was hard to tell who among them were prisoners and who were simply tired. The Japanese nurses sat on the ground in a neat line, their backs straight despite the ache in their bodies. They had slept little, unsure whether to call this place safety or captivity. The same American soldier from the day before approached, this time with a large metal pot. Steam rolled from it like breath in winter. He carried the same dark drink as before, coffee. When he poured it, the sound was soft, like rain slipping into puddles. One by one, tin cups filled with the bitter smell that had haunted their dreams. Some turned away, unable to bear it. Others watched silently, curiosity fighting fear. The soldier offered sugar again, a small gesture they didn't yet understand. Michiko took a packet in trembling hands, turning it over and over as if it were a secret message. Ayako accepted her cup without hesitation this time, though she still didn't smile. She studied the liquid with the same wary respect she once gave to medicine. Around her, the others whispered, small, cautious voices that rose and fell like distant waves. What if it's a test? What if they are watching how much we drink? Maybe they want to see if we trust them. No one knew the truth and no one dared to ask. Ayako took another sip, slower now. The taste was no kinder. It was sharp and acrid, as though someone had burned their rations and turned the ashes to water. Yet there was warmth in it, deep warmth that spread through her chest, quiet but steady. She didn't like the flavor, but she liked the feeling. For months, her hands had been cold. For months, everything she had touched had been broken or dying. Now, in a camp surrounded by her former enemies, she felt something alive again. She passed the cup to Michiko, who hesitated before drinking. The girl grimaced instantly. "It's awful," she said in a hushed voice.
"How do they drink this?"
Ayako didn't answer. She looked around the camp instead. The Americans were laughing nearby, sitting around their own fire, drinking the same black liquid as if it were the sweetest thing in the world. They were relaxed, unguarded, human. The sight confused her. She had been told they were monsters. She had expected cruelty. Instead, she saw faces lined not with hatred but exhaustion. Later, when the soldiers distributed bread and canned meat, Michiko whispered, "Why are they being kind?" Ayako said quietly, "Maybe kindness cost them nothing now." The hours passed slowly. Rain came and went. The women were given new blankets and soap. They watched the soldiers fix tents, clean rifles, write letters. The rhythm of camp life felt strange, disciplined but peaceful. For the first time, the nurses realized that even after war, life continued with small, ordinary motions. A cup poured, a shirt washed, a quiet joke between men who had seen too much. That night, they gathered near the edge of the camp where the fires burned low. Michiko opened a ration tin she had saved and shared it among them. The taste of foreign food made them uneasy, but hunger won. Ayako stared into the fire, her cup beside her again, half filled with cooling coffee. "I used to hate the smell," Michiko said softly. Ayako nodded. "It still burns the tongue. But it doesn't feel like poison anymore," Michiko added after a pause. "It feels like something alive." Ayako looked at her, surprised by the honesty. "Alive?" "Yes," Michiko said. "Like it's telling us we're still here." They fell silent again, watching the flames twist in the night air. The bitterness on their tongues remained, but it no longer felt like punishment. It was a reminder. The taste belonged to a world that was new and uncertain, one where survival was not measured by who fought, but by who endured. When the fire burned down to embers, Ayako poured the last of her coffee into the dirt, watching it disappear. The dark stain spread like ink through the soil, then faded. She thought of her hospital, her patients, her country, all swallowed by time, by surrender. by this strange new world that began with a single word, coffee. Before sleeping, she whispered to the others, "Tomorrow, if they offer it again, drink. Even if it's bitter. We will need to learn their warmth before we can understand their peace." In the tent next to them, the American soldiers talked softly. One of them said, "They don't smile much, do they?" Another replied, "Give it time. They'll learn the taste." The night deepened and the camp settled into uneasy quiet. For the women, the bitterness lingered long after the last drop was gone, clinging to their memories like smoke after fire. They didn't yet know it, but someday that same taste would return to them, not as fear, but as a reminder that even the bitter things could mean survival. They woke before sunrise. The camp was still, covered in fog that blurred the edges of tents and trees. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed, a strange sound in a place meant for soldiers, not farmers. The Japanese nurses sat close together, their thin blankets pulled tight, watching the horizon turn pale gold. For a few quiet moments, they could almost pretend they were back home, in some countryside village before the war. But then the smell came again, sharp, dark, unmistakable. Coffee. The soldiers were already awake, laughing softly, passing around tin mugs as if it were a morning ritual. The women watched them, unsure whether to envy or distrust the comfort in their movements. When one of the men noticed their stares, he raised his cup and smiled as though inviting them to share in something ordinary. The gesture was small, but it reminded them of everything they had lost: routine, peace, the feeling of safety in the simplest acts. Ayako lowered her gaze. The smell of the drink stirred something deep in her chest, not hunger, but memory. She thought of her father, who used to drink roasted barley tea before work. The scent had been soft and sweet, carrying the warmth of home. This was nothing like that. This was smoke and bitterness, heavy like the war itself. She wondered if the Americans knew that the drink they loved so much carried the same taste as destruction for those who had lost everything. As they sipped from their cups later that morning, the bitterness drew them inward. Each woman, silent and distant, slipped into her own thoughts. For Michiko, it was her mother's garden in Nagasaki, a patch of earth where the smell of tea leaves once mixed with the sea breeze. She could still see her mother's hands rinsing the tea kettle, still hear the slow whistle as it boiled. She had not seen that garden since the sky turned white one August morning. For another nurse, it was her younger brother's laughter, the way he used to run through the narrow streets holding his wooden toy plane high. He had written her once from the front saying, "I'll come back and we'll drink warm tea together." He never did. Now she held a cup of American coffee instead, and it felt like betrayal just to hold it. Ayako watched the others, sensing their memories, though none spoke them aloud. The taste of coffee was awakening ghosts. It wasn't just bitter because of the beans, it was bitter because of everything it forced them to remember. The world before the war had been defined by simplicity: rice, tea, silence, and the quiet pride of endurance. Now nothing was simple. Even kindness from the enemy carried confusion. When one of the soldiers passed by, Michiko tried to say thank you, arigato, but the words caught in her throat. The man only nodded, not understanding. He didn't need to. He was already moving on, his cup half empty, steam curling into the cold air. Ayako wondered what peace would taste like if it ever came. Would it be like this, a bitter first, then warm, then gone too quickly? She wanted to believe that there was sweetness hidden somewhere inside the harshness, just as there had been humanity hidden inside war. But her tongue found no sweetness, only the reminder that peace, like coffee, had to be learned slowly. That afternoon, the women were given new clothing, clean, plain, and free of insignia. Stripped of their rank, they felt weightless, like ghosts with no country. The American nurse in charge, a woman named Ellen, tried to smile as she handed them each a folded shirt. Her face was young but tired, her hands stained with iodine. When she saw Ayako hesitate to accept the shirt, she said softly, "No soldier now. Just woman." The phrase echoed in Ayako's mind long after Ellen left. Just woman. In that moment, she realized how long it had been since anyone had called her that. The war had taken their names, their softness, their youth. They had been turned into symbols, nurses, patriots, survivors, but never simply women. That evening, as they sat near the fire, the Americans brewed another pot. The aroma filled the camp again. This time no one flinched. Ayako accepted her cup without fear. The taste hadn't changed, still bitter, still foreign, but it no longer felt like punishment. Michiko took a sip beside her and said quietly, "It tastes less like smoke tonight." "Maybe because we've stopped burning," Ayako replied. For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire crackled softly, and above them the stars began to appear, dim, scattered, but still there. The world was broken, yet somehow still capable of warmth. Ayako looked into her cup one last time, seeing not the black surface of bitterness, but her own reflection. She thought of her father's tea, of her mother's laughter, of the home she might never see again. The past was gone, but the warmth in her hands was real. That would have to be enough. The camp settled into a rhythm, slow, uncertain, but alive. Days began with the same ritual, the sound of boots on gravel, the faint clang of tin cups, and the bitter scent of coffee curling through the cold morning air. It was strange how quickly captivity could feel like routine. The women no longer flinched at every voice, nor did they lower their eyes when soldiers passed. They were still prisoners, yes, but the fear that had once burned inside them was now a quiet ember instead of a storm. Ayako often watched the Americans from a distance. They worked with mechanical precision, building, repairing, cleaning, always moving, as if motion itself kept away the memories of war. Sometimes, when one of them caught her staring, they would nod politely, neither smiling nor frowning. There was no hatred now, just an uneasy kind of recognition, one survivor acknowledging another. The camp's infirmary was a long, narrow tent filled with cots and the scent of antiseptic. The women were assigned to help there, cleaning bandages and sorting supplies. It was a strange return to their old lives, tending to wounds, this time on the very people who had been their enemies. Michiko's hands trembled the first time she touched an American's arm to change a dressing. The soldier winced, not from pain, but from surprise. Then he said something she didn't understand, his tone soft, almost apologetic. She nodded anyway. Kindness, she was learning, had a language of its own. Ellen, the American nurse, became their quiet bridge between two worlds. She was patient, explaining gestures, showing them how to use the strange equipment in the tent. Syringes, rubber gloves, clean gauze wrapped in wax paper. Her Japanese was poor, their English worse, but somehow through smiles and gestures they managed. When Ellen poured coffee into metal cups during breaks, the women would join her without hesitation now. It still burned their throats, but they no longer grimaced. One afternoon, Ayako noticed a new arrival. A soldier limping heavily, his uniform soaked from rain. His hand was wrapped in a crude bandage, blood already seeping through. She moved toward him instinctively, the way she had hundreds of times before, reaching for clean cloth. The soldier's eyes widened, startled that a Japanese woman was tending to him. For a heartbeat, the air between them froze, both remembering what their sides had done to each other. Then he nodded, lowering his hand toward her. She worked in silence, cutting away the old bandage. When she finished, the soldier flexed his fingers and looked at her awkwardly. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small ration pack, and placed it beside her. Sugar cubes, wrapped in paper. She frowned, unsure what he meant. Then he pointed at the coffee pot across the tent and smiled. That evening, Ayako dropped one of the cubes into her cup for the first time. The sweetness startled her. Soft, fleeting, barely there, but enough to change the whole taste. She stared into the cup, her reflection rippling in the surface, and thought, so this is how they drink it. Michiko noticed and asked, "Does it still taste like medicine?" Ayako shook her head. "No," she said quietly. "It tastes like something trying to heal." The next morning, when Ellen served them coffee again, she added sugar to every cup without asking. It was a small gesture, yet it transformed the air around the table. The women sipped slowly, speaking little. The bitterness no longer felt like punishment. It was just part of something larger, something shared. Days turned into weeks. The women began to walk freely within the camp, helping wherever they could, carrying water, folding bandages, washing linens. They had stopped counting the days since surrender. Now they counted small changes instead. The way soldiers know, longer stared at them as enemies, the way laughter sometimes filled the air again. At night, when the fires burned low, Ayako often sat with Ellen outside the tent. They shared coffee in silence, watching the stars fade into clouds. Ellen would sometimes hum a song, something soft and slow that reminded Ayako of lullabies from home. It was strange to feel comfort beside someone who had once represented everything she feared. Stranger still was realizing that she no longer knew how to hate her. One evening, Michiko asked, "Do you think they will ever let us go home?" Ayako hesitated before answering. "Yes," she said, "but I think home will not look the same. We will not look the same." Michiko frowned. "Because of them?" Ayako shook her head. "Because of what we learned from them." In the distance, a trumpet sounded, the signal for lights out. The women finished their coffee and stood, brushing dust from their clothes. As they walked back toward their tent, Ayako glanced once more at the firelight reflecting off the cups they carried. It struck her then how something so simple, so bitter, had become their quiet language of peace. The coffee hadn't changed, they had. The rain came hard that week, turning the ground into a patchwork of mud and puddles. The camp smelled of wet canvas and smoke. The women worked quietly, mending torn uniforms, folding bandages, and tending to small wounds. The monotony of the days had softened them. Like stones in a river smoothed by endless current, they spoke less now of fear and more of memories, of home, of warmth, of the taste of tea they once knew. Every morning the same soldier who had offered them that first cup arrived with the coffee pot. His name, they had learned through Ellen, was Corporal Daniels. He was young, with eyes too calm for a man who had survived battle. He never said much, just nodded as he handed each of them a cup. But there was something in the way he did it, slow and deliberate, as if he understood what it meant to offer warmth to those who expected cruelty. That morning, he brought something new. After pouring their coffee, he placed a small packet beside each cup. It was wrapped in white paper the size of a coin. Michiko looked at it curiously. "What is this?" she asked. Ellen smiled faintly. "Sugar," she said, forming the word with care so they would remember it. Ayako hesitated, then tore her packet open. The grains glittered like tiny crystals in the dim light. When she stirred them into the dark drink, it hissed softly, the sweetness dissolving into the bitterness. She took a sip and paused. It was still sharp, still foreign, but something had changed. The taste lingered on her tongue like an apology. The others followed. Their expressions softened as they drank, not from pleasure but from recognition. Something inside them began to understand that this ritual, the offering of coffee, the addition of sugar, wasn't just about sustenance. It was language, a way of saying we see you, we mean no harm. Later, Michiko caught Daniel's eye across the yard and raised her cup slightly, unsure if she was allowed to smile. He smiled first. It was a small gesture, gone in an instant, but it made the world feel less divided. That night, the women sat by the dim fire with their cups, steam curling into the darkness. They spoke in low voices, careful not to be overheard. "He gave us sugar," Michiko said, stirring her drink even though it was already sweetened. Ayako nodded. "Yes, why?" Ayako looked into the fire. "Because bitterness can't be shared forever, not even between enemies." The others fell quiet. They watched the flames dance, each lost in her own thoughts. For the first time since capture, laughter rose in the camp, not from the soldiers but from the nurses. It was soft, uncertain, like something forgotten rediscovered. Michiko had accidentally spilled her coffee and tried to scoop it back into the cup with both hands. The others teased her gently and she blushed, her face warming in the firelight. Across the camp, Daniels looked up at the sound and smiled again. The same faint, weary smile that belonged to someone who'd seen enough sorrow to appreciate the smallest joy. The days continued in quiet repetition. The coffee ritual became something expected, no longer a symbol of fear but of connection. When the pot arrived, no one hesitated. Sometimes Ellen joined them, sitting cross-legged on the ground, teaching them new English words: water, blanket, friend. Each word felt heavy on their tongues, strange and powerful. Ayako began to keep a small notebook she'd found in the infirmary. writing down English words phonetically beside their Japanese meanings. When Ellen noticed, she brought her a pencil stub and said, "You learn fast." Ayako didn't answer, just smiled, the way one does when understanding replaces language. One evening, the rain finally stopped. The air was clean and sharp, the sky streaked with silver clouds. The camp seemed almost peaceful. Daniels walked past their tent, his boots leaving prints in the wet ground. Ayako called out softly, "Corporal." It was the first time she had spoken directly to him. He turned surprised. She held out a folded handkerchief neatly mended. "For your hand," she said, pointing to the bandage she had changed days ago. He took it, nodded once, and replied quietly, "Thank you." The word was simple, but it struck her like something sacred. Gratitude from an enemy was not something she had imagined. When he walked away, she sat down, feeling the echo of that moment linger between them. That night, Michiko whispered, "You spoke to him?" Ayako smiled faintly. "Yes. Do you think he meant it?" She looked toward the tent where Daniel slept. "Yes," she said, "because kindness is the only thing in war that doesn't lie." The camp slept under a moon that was half hidden by clouds. The fires burned low, the coffee pot still warm beside the coals. Somewhere a soldier coughed, somewhere else a nurse whispered a prayer. Between those two sounds, in the narrow space where silence lived, something fragile had begun to grow. It wasn't peace yet, not fully, but it was the beginning of something that felt like it. The rain had stopped for good now. Days grew warmer, the mud in the camp drying into cracked earth that smelled faintly of rust and smoke. The women no longer counted the days. They had stopped asking when they would go home. Instead, they had learned to measure time in smaller ways, by the rising of steam from their morning cups, by the softness in the soldiers' voices, by how easily their hands could now fold bandages without shaking. Ayako had begun writing. In a small, weather-stained notebook she had found near the infirmary's supply tent, she wrote every night after the camp lights went out. At first they were simple entries, names of the women, English words she had learned, fragments of memory she didn't want to lose. But slowly the words became more than record-keeping. They became confessions, the kind she could never speak aloud. "We were told they would hurt us," she wrote, "but they gave us sugar. We were told they were cruel, but they shared their warmth. I think now that we did not understand our enemy. Perhaps they did not understand us either." She hid the notebook under her blanket each morning. Writing was dangerous, not because anyone would punish her, but because it forced her to remember. Memory was its own kind of wound. Michiko often saw her writing and asked what she was recording. "Everything we will forget," Ayako said, "because someday we will pretend this never happened. But I don't want to forget the taste of the first coffee I drank without fear." That evening, Ellen sat with them near the fire. The conversation was halting, scattered between broken words and gestures. Yet in the pauses there was understanding. Ellen showed them a letter she was writing home. Neat lines in looping English signed with a name the women had learned to pronounce, Ellen Parker. She read a few sentences aloud, slow enough that they could follow. "The Japanese women are quiet but kind. I think of them as nurses, not prisoners. They remind me that mercy is easier to give than hatred." The words hung in the air like a prayer. Michiko leaned closer as though she could feel their warmth. When Ellen finished, Ayako asked softly, "You write to family?" "Yes," Ellen said. "My mother." Ayako nodded. "You tell her." "About us?" Ellen smiled faintly. "Yes, I tell her you are brave." Ayako didn't know what to say. Brave was a word she hadn't heard in months. It felt too generous, too heavy for women who had done nothing but survive. But something in her chest loosened all the same. Later that night, after Ellen left, Michiko looked at Ayako's notebook. "You should write to someone too," she said. "Even if you can't send it," so Ayako did. She began a letter not meant for delivery, a letter to her younger brother, who had died 2 years earlier on an island neither of them could pronounce. Her hand trembled as she wrote, "You would laugh if you saw me now. I drink the enemy's drink and live in their tents. But I think you would understand. You always said the world was bigger than what we were told. Maybe you were right." The next morning, the camp was alive with movement. Soldiers were packing supplies. Rumors spread that the women might soon be released. The thought should have filled them with joy, but it didn't. Home had become an idea, not a place. They had learned to live inside the rhythm of this strange, fragile peace. Daniels passed by their tent, carrying his rifle slung over his shoulder. He nodded to Ayako. "You'll be free soon," he said slowly, his English careful, almost hesitant, as if freedom itself were a fragile thing. Ayako looked at him, then at the cup in his other hand. "Coffee?" she asked. He grinned. "Always." That night, Ayako wrote again. "They say we may leave soon. I do not know where we will go. The world outside these wires is still broken, but here inside this camp, I have seen something worth remembering. The drink that once felt like poison now tastes like life." When the lights went out, she closed the notebook and placed it under her pillow. The night air was cool and gentle. Michiko was already asleep beside her, her breathing soft and steady. Ayako whispered into the dark as though speaking to her brother's spirit. "You were right. The world is bigger than war. And peace. Peace tastes bitter at first." The next morning, when Ellen came to say goodbye, she noticed the notebook peeking from Ayako's bag. "Diary?" she asked. Ayako smiled. "Yes. May I read?" Ellen said. Ayako shook her head. "No," she whispered. "It's for remembering, not for explaining." Ellen didn't press. She only nodded and handed her one last thing, a small paper packet. Inside were 2 cubes of sugar. The day they were released, the sky was impossibly blue, the kind of blue that almost hurt to look at after months of living beneath canvas and smoke. The American flag hung limp in the still air, and the guards who had once watched them so carefully now simply nodded as the women passed through the gate. There were no cheers, no salutes, just quiet footsteps and the creak of the truck that would take them away. Ayako clutched her notebook tightly in her lap, the pages soft from use. Michiko sat beside her, staring through the wooden slats at the endless road ahead. Freedom felt strange, almost heavy. They had dreamed of this day for months, yet now that it had come, it felt less like release and more like stepping into another kind of uncertainty. The truck rolled past burned fields and silent villages. The air carried the faint scent of ash, not fresh but old, settled into the soil. Everything they passed seemed half alive, as though the land itself was still deciding whether to keep breathing. In the distance, mountains stood like silent witnesses to the ruin below. No one spoke for hours. Then Michiko whispered, "Do you think they will believe us?" Ayako looked at her. "Who?" "Our people, when we tell them how we were treated." Ayako turned her gaze back to the road. "They will believe what they want to believe," she said softly, "but I will remember what I saw." When they reached the city, the women were left at a small station on the edge of a bombed-out town. The Americans gave them food, water, and simple instructions. Go home if you can. Then they were gone, leaving, the women standing on cracked pavement under a sky too bright for such ruin. Home, they discovered, was not what it once was. The streets were narrower now, buildings flattened or rebuilt with scrap wood. Familiar places had vanished, replaced by silence. Some families were gone entirely, names erased by fire and time. Ayako found her parents' house standing but empty, the garden overgrown. On the table near the door lay an old teapot, chipped but intact. She ran her fingers along its edge and felt a memory stir, the smell of barley tea, the sound of laughter. Then she remembered the taste of coffee, bitter and foreign, and realized that both flavors now lived inside her. That night she lit a candle and opened her notebook. Her handwriting trembled, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of what she carried. "We came home," she wrote, "but we did not return the same. We left as nurses of war and came back as witnesses of peace. The drink they gave us, the one we thought was poison, I now crave each morning. Perhaps that is how peace begins, as something you learn to taste, slowly." In the weeks that followed, she and Michiko found work at a small clinic. Patients came with broken bones, hollow eyes, and quiet grief. When the Americans left Japan entirely, they left behind empty tins, blankets, and, curiously, sacks of coffee beans. The smell filled the marketplace, strange but not unwelcome. Vendors sold it in paper bags marked Kohai. At first, people were suspicious. "It's too strong," they said. Too bitter, not like tea. But slowly, curiosity replaced hesitation. Small cafes appeared in the ruins of cities, their signs hand-painted and hopeful. People gathered there to talk, to remember, to rebuild. And in every cup, there was something foreign and familiar at once. A reminder that peace, too, was acquired taste. One morning, Michiko arrived at the clinic with a smile. "They've opened one near the station," she said, "a coffee house." Ayako raised an eyebrow. "Coffee?" "Yes," Michiko said, laughing. "Real coffee. They say it tastes just like the Americans." That evening, after work, they went together. The cafe was small, 2 tables, a counter, and a single machine that hissed softly like steam from a train. The owner, a kind-faced man with burn scars on his hands, served them with quiet pride. When Ayako lifted the cup to her lips, the scent was the same, bitter, smoky, unmistakable. But this time, she didn't hesitate. The taste was sharp, yes, but behind the bitterness was warmth, the same warmth that had once filled a prisoner's camp far away. She smiled faintly. "It doesn't taste like medicine anymore," Michiko said. "No," Ayako replied. "It tastes like memory." They sat in silence for a long time, letting the moment settle. Around them, people spoke softly, laughter beginning to return to the air. The world was still broken, but it was rebuilding, one small kindness at a time. Before leaving, Ayako took out her notebook and wrote one final entry. The American said, "That's coffee, black and hot. We thought it was medicine. We were wrong. It was a bridge." Years passed. The war became a story told in classrooms and whispered by old men in the shade. Japan rebuilt itself brick by brick, its cities growing tall and bright where once there had been ash and silence. People walked faster now, dressed cleaner, spoke of the future with confidence. But in quiet corners, in small shops tucked between narrow streets, some memories refused to fade. Every morning, Ayako would visit a small cafe near the river. The owner knew her by name, always greeting her with the same words. "Black and hot as usual?" She would nod, sit by the window and watch the world move. Children in uniforms running to school, men on bicycles, women hanging laundry from narrow balconies. The scent of coffee filled the room, warm and constant, and sometimes she would close her eyes and be back in the camp again, beneath gray skies and barbed wire, the sound of foreign voices softening into something kind. She had grown old, her hair silver and fine, her hands marked with the faint tremor of time. Yet when she lifted the cup, she did it with the same care she once gave to patients and wounds, gently, deliberately, as if holding something sacred. The first sip was always bitter, as it had been all her life, but she no longer tried to hide the taste. She had learned long ago that some things were meant to be bitter, to remind you of where you've been. Across from her, Michiko still laughed easily, though age had softened her voice. They met once a week, always in the same spot. Sometimes they spoke about their lives, the children they'd raised, the people they'd lost, the years that had passed faster than they could hold on to them. Other times they said nothing at all. Silence had become its own language between them. One morning, as the first snow began to fall, Michiko set her cup down and said quietly, "Do you ever wonder what happened to them?" Ayako looked at her. "To whom?" "The Americans, Ellen, Daniels, the ones who gave us the coffee." Ayako smiled faintly. "I think about them every time I drink it," she said. "Maybe they think of us too." Michiko nodded. "Strange, isn't it? That we met peace before we met freedom." Ayako's gaze drifted to the window. Snowflakes melted against the glass, leaving faint traces that vanished as quickly as they came. "Peace never arrives the way people expect," she said softly. "It doesn't wave a flag or announce itself with trumpets. It comes quietly. Sometimes it even tastes bitter at first." They finished their cups in silence. Outside, the city pulsed with life, a rhythm rebuilt from ruin, steady and unbroken. When Michiko left, Ayako remained behind, tracing the rim of her cup with one finger. The warmth lingered, and with it, memory. That evening, back in her small apartment, she opened her old notebook. The pages had yellowed, the ink faded, but the words still breathed. She ran her hand across the first entry. "We thought it was medicine." She smiled to herself. "Maybe it was," she whispered. "Just not the kind we expected." She turned to the last blank page and began to write once more. It has been many years. I have lived long enough to forget many things. The sound of sirens, the color of uniforms, the fear that once owned my heart. But I still remember the first warmth of peace. It was not in a handshake nor a treaty. It was in a cup of coffee, black and hot, shared between strangers who had no reason to trust each other. And maybe that is how the world heals, one small kindness at a time. When she finished, she set down her pen and looked out the window. The city lights shimmered on the water below, soft and golden. Somewhere, someone was laughing. Somewhere else, someone was weeping. The world had not changed completely. It never does. But it had learned something. Ayako lifted her cup one last time. The steam rose slowly, curling in the air like the breath of a memory. She watched it fade and whispered to the empty room, "You were right, Father. The bitter things teach us how to live." She drank, eyes half closed, and for a moment she wasn't an old woman in a cafe. She was that same nurse again, young, frightened, holding a tin mug under a gray sky, learning for the first time that kindness could exist even in the hands of an enemy. The warmth reached her chest, spreading through her like sunlight after a long winter. The taste was still bitter, yes, but behind it was something else, faint and enduring. It was peace. In our last story, the German prisoners couldn't understand a plate of meatballs and spaghetti. In this one, Japanese nurses mistook black coffee for medicine. Different wars, different captives, but the same truth remained.